I'm Caleb, 38 male. I live in a glass and stone mansion carved into the hills overlooking Austin, Texas, a place I built as a fortress against the world. I run a cybersecurity firm that became my shield, my purpose, and my silent revenge against the people who cast me out. After 15 years of absolute silence, the family that erased me from their lives showed up at my gate, and in doing so, they handed me the key to finally locking them out forever. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The Texas sun is a demanding thing. It bleaches the sky to a pale, hazy blue and bakes the limestone of my terrace until you can feel the heat radiating through the soles of your shoes. This morning, it felt particularly relentless, slicing across the infinity pool and glinting off the windows of my $12 million home in Westlake Hills. Everything here was a monument to success. The polished concrete floors, the minimalist furniture imported from Italy, the art on the walls that cost more than the house I grew up in. It was all proof that I had won. But the silence inside these walls was a constant reminder of what I'd lost to get here. I stood on the balcony, a cup of black coffee in my hand, watching hummingbirds zip and hover around a feeder, their wings a frantic blur of motion. They were restless, just like the secrets I kept locked away. My thumb traced the cool, smooth surface of the jade ring I wore on my right hand. It was the only thing I had left from my grandmother, the one person in my family who had ever looked at me and not seen a disappointment. I'd worn it for so long that its weight felt like a part of me, a permanent anchor in a life that had often felt unmoored. There was a tiny, almost imperceptible groove carved into the inner band, a detail I'd felt 1,000 times but never truly understood, like a word whispered in a language I didn't speak. A soft chime echoed through the house, tearing through the quiet. The front gate. I instinctively glanced at the security monitor on the wall, a system I'd designed myself. Its behavioral recognition software was the cornerstone of my company, Nexus Guard. The motto I'd built my empire on was simple: no one watches over you but you. The camera feed sharpened, and the faces that appeared on the screen felt like ghosts from another life. My adoptive father, Harold, looked smaller than I remembered, his posture stooped, his hair a thin veil of gray over a scalp I'd never seen. My adoptive mother, Margaret, stood beside him, a string of pearls clutched at her throat like a shield, her expression tight and unreadable. Behind them were my siblings. Donovan, my older brother, was heavier now, the athletic build of his youth softened into the weary slump of middle age. And then there was Isabel, my younger sister, hiding the gray in her hair with a shade of blonde that was too bright, her two young children clinging to her legs. They stood there, blinking in the harsh sunlight, looking like travelers who had taken a wrong turn and ended up in a foreign land. 15 years. 15 years of missed holidays, ignored birthdays, and unanswered calls. 15 years of being systematically cut out of every family photo, every reunion, every part of their lives. And now they were here. I tapped the screen on my phone and the heavy iron gate swung open. I didn't move from the balcony. I watched them walk the long, winding stone driveway, a distance that felt more symbolic than physical. Each step they took was a year of silence, a year of pain I had swallowed and converted into fuel. By the time they reached the massive oak door, I was waiting. I opened it not with anger, not with joy, but with the flat, emotionless calm of a man who had long ago accepted that love was a conditional offering. "Can I help you?" I asked. My tone was polite, the same one I used for business associates or strangers asking for directions. They shuffled inside, their eyes wide as they took in the cavernous entryway, the floating staircase, and the view of the Austin skyline through the far wall of glass. The air smelled of the single-origin Colombian coffee I had just brewed, a scent of quiet luxury that seemed to make them uncomfortable. I led them into the main living area, and they sat stiffly on the edges of the Italian leather sofas, their complements brittle and hollow. "This place is incredible, Cal," Donovan muttered, his gaze fixed on a sculpture in the corner. Isabel's eyes darted around the room, assessing, calculating. "You've done so well for yourself." I didn't respond. I just watched them, my hand resting on the table, the jade ring cool against my skin. I let the silence stretch, filling the space between us until it was a physical presence in the room. On the large tablet lying. On the coffee table, I had an article pulled up from the Wall Street Journal, published just last night. The headline read, "Tech CEO Caleb Thorne pledges $10 million to Children's Tech Literacy Fund at Charity Gala." My face was captured mid-speech, confident and composed. Their praise quickly morphed from admiration into suggestion, and finally into the real reason they were here. It was Harold who spoke, his voice carefully measured. We were thinking perhaps it's time to build something together again, a family venture, a fresh start. A smile touched my lips, but it held no warmth. The jade on my finger felt colder than ever. Before I could answer, a wave of memory pulled me back to a gray, drizzling city, to a house where I was always the shadow, to the night it all fell apart. I looked at their hopeful, greedy faces and knew they weren't here for me. They were here for what I represented. Before we talk about business, I said softly, my voice cutting through their nervous energy, you should probably hear a story. My finger swiped across the tablet, closing the article and opening a folder I had prepared long ago, a folder labeled simply 15 years. The first photo appeared, a happy family portrait at a wedding I was never invited to. The trial was about to begin. I was born into the persistent, melancholy drizzle of Seattle. Our house was a picture-perfect colonial near Lake Washington, complete with a white picket fence, a golden retriever, and the polished veneer of a happy family. It was the kind of home that looked perfect in Christmas cards, but up close, you could see the cracks in the foundation. From a young age, I learned that my family operated on a complex economy of attention, and I was perpetually bankrupt. My achievements were met with distracted nods, my report cards with a S placed on the fridge without comment. They were minor events in a household that revolved around brighter, louder stars. Donovan was the athlete, his basketball trophies gleaming in the den, each one earning a proud clap on the back from my father. Isabel was the artist, her violin recitals and school plays drawing tears and effusive praise from my mother. I was the quiet one, the reader, the thinker, whose successes were too internal to be celebrated. My 10th birthday was the day I finally understood my place. A surprise party had been planned, the living room filled with balloons and a professionally hired clown waiting in the driveway. Then the phone rang. Donovan's playoff game had been moved up. Within minutes, the house was empty. The cake sat on the counter, its candles unlit. The balloons drooped and the clown drove away, his fee paid but his act unperformed. I sat alone in the kitchen with the dog, eating pizza out of a box, and learned a lesson that would shape the rest of my life. Celebration was a currency they would never spend on me. I tried foolishly to enter their world. I joined the basketball team, hoping to earn a single glance of approval from Harold. After a game where I barely touched the ball, he put a hand on my shoulder and said with an air of gentle finality, "You'll never be Donovan's son, it's just not in you." When Isabel borrowed my new laptop for a school project and returned it with a cracked screen, she laughed it off. "Caleb is so dramatic," she told our parents, and they believed her without question. I learned to swallow my protests, to absorb the injustice. Silence was my shield. The only light in that gray world was my grandmother, Beatrice. She was my mother's mother, a woman who saw through the family's carefully constructed facade. While everyone else was at Donovan's games, she would be the lone figure in the bleachers at my science fairs or debate tournaments. I remember one rainy afternoon, she showed up at the school auditorium for my robotics competition, clutching a bag of homemade cookies she'd protected from the downpour with a plastic bag. When my machine won, her applause was the only sound I heard. "You have a light inside you, Caleb," she told me later, her voice firm. "Don't you ever let them dim it." She brought me books, always wrapped in plastic to protect them from the Seattle rain. Those books were my escape, windows into worlds where being different was a strength, not a weakness. She also gave me a small blue notebook and a secret task. An experiment in observation, she called it. She told me to write down what I saw, not just what people said, but what they did, who looked away when you spoke, who smiled only when they knew others were watching. "It's not about holding grudges," she explained. "It's about survival. You need to know the map of the room before you can navigate it." That notebook became my most prized possession, a catalog of unspoken truths. It was filled with notes about my father's forced smiles, my mother's selective hearing, and my siblings' casual cruelties. Then, the week after Beatrice passed away, it vanished from my room. I searched everywhere, but it was gone. I never found out who took it, but I had my suspicions. Margaret's favorite phrase, often deployed when I was on the losing end of a family dispute, was "family is everything." But what she meant was that the family's image was everything. Upholding the hierarchy was everything. My role was to be the quiet, stable background against which my siblings could shine. One evening, while cleaning out a closet, I found an old shoebox of my mother's college photos. In one, she had her arm around a young woman with dark, intelligent eyes I'd never seen before. They looked like best friends sharing a secret joy. Margaret had never once mentioned her. I didn't know it then, but that stranger's face would one day become the key to understanding my own. That night, riding home in the back of the family car, I watched the rain slide down the window and made two promises to myself. First, I would start asking the right questions. And second, I would learn to wait, because sometimes silence tells you more than words ever could. Now, sitting in my mansion across from the people who had taught me that lesson, the silence was deafening. and this time I was the one in control of it. The day we buried Beatrice, the Seattle sky wept without restraint. The rain fell in cold, sharp needles, soaking the church steps and clinging to the black coats of the mourners. I sat by myself in a back pew, the jade ring she had given me just 2 nights before her heart failed, feeling cold and heavy on my finger. Her last words to me echoed in my mind, a faint but persistent whisper. You carry a light they'll never understand. Those words were my armor against the performative grief that filled the church. Margaret dabbed at her perfectly dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. Donovan kept checking his watch, his restlessness a blatant display of impatience. Isabel played the part of the grieving granddaughter, but I saw her stifle a sigh when the eulogy went on too long. Their sorrow was a costume, and it didn't fit well. At the reception held in a damp, chilly church hall, a lawyer in a rumpled suit cleared his throat and announced the reading of the will. A hush fell over the room, but it wasn't one of reverence. It was anticipation. I stood near the back, my clothes still damp from walking to the church alone. The will was brief. Donovan received a set of antique golf clubs. Isabel was given a collection of paintings Beatrice had always claimed to dislike. My parents were named as benefactors of a small charity fund. Then it was my turn. To my grandson Caleb, the lawyer read, pausing for effect, I leave the sum of $5,000 and one personal item of his choosing. He opened a small velvet box to reveal an empty slot. It appears the item, a jade ring, is already in his possession. A few heads turned in my direction. I saw Margaret flinch. Harold's jaw tightened. That's it, he said, his voice sharp with disbelief. She always played favorites, he snapped, his words aimed at me like daggers. I couldn't stand the suffocating atmosphere a moment longer. I stepped outside into the relentless rain, gasping for air that didn't taste of hypocrisy. Harold followed me out, his voice a low, furious hiss. She was a foolish woman, always blind to what was right in front of her, but if you had any decency, you'd be grateful for what you were given. You mean $5,000 and a ring I already had? I shot back, the bitterness I'd suppressed for years finally spilling out. His face hardened. You were never supposed to be part of this family, he snarled, the words landing like physical blows. We took you in, that should have been enough. My blood ran cold. What are you talking about? He didn't even blink. You're adopted. Your birth mother was a college friend of Margaret's, a troubled girl. She died in a car accident not long after you were born and you were left with us. We did our duty. The world tilted on its axis. The rain, the cold, the grief, it all faded into a dull roar in my ears. Every memory of my life suddenly felt like a lie, a carefully constructed stage play in which I was the only one who didn't know my lines. Why didn't you tell me? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Margaret appeared at his side, her gaze fixed on the wet pavement. We thought it was for the best, she said softly. It wouldn't have changed anything. You had a roof over your head, you had a family, that should have been enough. They turned and walked back inside, leaving me alone under the awning, drenched in a rain that felt like it was washing away the very foundations of my identity. Later, when most of the guests had departed, I asked if I could join them for the private family meal. Harold looked at me with cold disdain. If you can't show a little gratitude, Caleb, then you don't belong here. Then I guess I never did, I replied, the woe. RDS tasting like ash, I walked away without looking back. That night in my childhood bedroom that no longer felt like mine, I held the jade ring under a lamp. I turned it over and over, my fingers tracing its familiar lines. That's when I felt it again, the tiny groove on the inside. It wasn't a flaw, it was a seam. I pressed my fingernail into it and a minuscule latch clicked open. The ring was a locket. Folded inside, impossibly small, was a slip of paper. On it were 3 words and a string of characters, find your own light. RG317. There was no signature, but I knew it was from Beatrice. It was a final message, a clue. Later, I went through the legal documents from the will one more time. Tucked away between insurance policies was a receipt for a safety deposit box. The primary holder was Beatrice. The secondary contact was a name I didn't recognize, Elena Vargas. I knew what I had to do. The $5,000 wasn't an insult, it was an escape fund. It wouldn't be enough to build a new life from scratch, but it was enough to start one. I packed a single bag that night. The next morning, I bought a one-way ticket to Austin, Texas, a city where no one knew my name. Now, 15 years later, I looked at Harold across the expensive, polished glass of my coffee table. The history of that moment hung between us. I slowly took the jade ring off my finger and placed it on the table. It made a soft, definitive click against the glass. RG317, I said, my voice even. Does that sequence mean anything to you? The color drained from his face. It was just a flicker, a brief moment of panic in his cold eyes, but it was enough. He remembered, and he knew that I had finally found the map. Austin received me not with a welcome, but with the suffocating indifference of a city in the grip of a Texas summer. I arrived with one duffel bag, $5,000, and a name that meant nothing to anyone. My first home was a tiny room in a shared apartment with a ceiling fan that clicked like a time bomb and roommates who communicated mostly through passive-aggressive notes on the fridge. I lived on instant ramen and cheap coffee, rationing every dollar. I took any tech support job I could find, fixing printers in stuffy offices, troubleshooting software for impatient strangers over the phone. But at night, my real work began. Fueled by caffeine and a desperate need to prove my own existence, I taught myself to code. I devoured books on cybersecurity, cryptography, and behavioral analytics. The digital world became my sanctuary, a place where lineage didn't matter, only logic. The jade ring never left my finger. It became a totem, an anchor to the woman who had believed in me and a key to the future she had hinted at. Whenever doubt crept in, I would twist it, feeling the faint groove on the inside, and remember the mission: find your own light. My first breakthrough came during SXSW, the city's massive tech and culture festival. I used a chunk of my dwindling savings to buy a badge and wandered through the crowded convention center, feeling like an imposter. In a packed lecture hall, I saw her name on the program, Dr. Elena Vargas, presenting on behavioral encryption. She was older than I'd expected, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. During the Q&A, I asked a question, technical, specific, and designed to show I understood the core of her work. Her eyes found me in the crowd, and for a moment she held my gaze, a flicker of curiosity in her expression. A few months later, I entered a local hackathon. My team didn't win, but our project, a prototype for an intrusion prevention system based on user behavior rather than static firewalls, caught the attention of a few angel investors. It wasn't flashy, but it was smart. It was the seed of what would become Nexus Guard. I spent the next few weeks pitching to anyone who would listen. I got 27 rejections in a row. The feedback was always the same: no track record, no experience, no capital. Then one morning, an anonymous email appeared in my inbox. It had no sender, no subject, just a single line of text: RG317, don't forget. A jolt went through me. It was a sign. A week later, a man named Jackson, who had been one of the judges at the hackathon, found me at the coffee shop where I spent most of my nights coding. He slid a check for $200,000 across the table. "This isn't charity," he said, his expression serious. "I believe in the way your mind works." That check was the birth of Nexus Guard. Our first office was a windowless room in a rundown office park, with wires taped to the ceiling and a broken air conditioner. It was just three of us: me, a brilliant DevOps engineer named Layla, and a front-end developer named Marcus. We worked 16-hour days, fueled by cheap pizza and the terrifying, exhilarating pressure of building something from nothing. I wrote the core code myself, every line infused with a piece of my own story, a system designed to detect intruders by learning what normal behavior looked like, just as I had learned to survive by observing the subtle patterns of my family. Another anonymous email arrived: 317 keys soon. It was a breadcrumb, a message from a ghost, and it kept me going. But as Nexus Guard began to grow, so did the shadows from my past. At an industry event, a rival CEO casually mentioned, "Funny, I thought your family said you washed out of the tech scene." I froze. He continued, oblivious. "Yeah, saw some old forum posts from your sister, I think. Said you had a breakdown and moved away." That night I didn't sleep. I dug through the internet's archives, using skills I'd honed for my company to uncover my own history. It was all there. Isabel, under various pseudonyms, had been carefully curating a narrative about me for years: the unstable, ungrateful, failed son. At the same time, our company servers experienced their first sophisticated attack. It wasn't a brute force attempt. It was subtle, behavioral, designed to mimic our own systems. It failed, but I traced the attack's digital signature back to a proxy that, with enough work, I connected to a real estate development firm in Seattle, Donovan's firm. They had erased me from their lives, but they had never stopped watching. They were monitoring my rise, one of them trying to sabotage it, the other trying to poison my reputation. I didn't retaliate, I didn't expose them, not yet. I stayed quiet, just as Beatrice had taught me. I had work to do. By year 4, Nexus Guard had offices in 5 cities. By year 5, we went public. The IPO made me a billionaire overnight. The articles in Forbes and Wired never mentioned my family. I was the self-made man, the orphan prodigy who built an empire from scratch. I let them print the myth because the truth was more complicated. I knew Beatrice had left me more than a ring and $5,000. She had left me a puzzle. And I sensed that my family, sitting in my living room 15 years later, were the final missing piece. The living room was a stage, and I was finally the director. The light from the setting sun slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick with unspoken history, a tension so palpable it felt like static electricity. They sat on my white leather sofa, looking small and out of place, like actors who had wandered into the wrong play. Harold cleared his throat, breaking the silence. He attempted a tone of paternal authority, but it was hollow, weakened by the opulence that surrounded him. "Caleb, we didn't come here to ask for handouts," he began, his words carefully rehearsed. "We've had some financial setbacks. Donovan's latest project fell through. We thought, given your success, this could be an opportunity, a chance to start fresh." Donovan, ever impatient, jumped in. "2 million, he said, the number hanging in the air, "just as a seed investment. We could partner on a new venture, build something real together for the family." Isabel nodded eagerly, her smile practiced and bright. "We're not asking for charity, Cal. This is about reconnecting, about being a family again." Family? The word was a weapon they had used against me for years, and now they were trying to offer it back as a gift. I said nothing. I simply picked up the remote and turned on the large screen mounted on the wall. A silent slideshow began to play. It started with a photo from Donovan's wedding, the whole family beaming, a conspicuous gap where I should have been. Then a Christmas photo, everyone in matching sweaters around a fireplace. A Thanksgiving dinner, the table laden with food, every seat filled but one. It was a visual history of my erasure, a 15-year montage of moments I was never invited to share. Interspersed were screenshots of Isabel's social media posts, public declarations of gratitude for her real family, the ones who truly mattered. They stared at the screen, their faces shifting from confusion to discomfort to dawning horror. Margaret's hand went to her pearls. Donovan's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle throbbing. Isabel's carefully constructed smile dissolved. I placed my tablet on the coffee table and swiped to a new screen displaying a series of emails. Some were from Margaret to her friends, explaining my absence from family events with vague allusions to my instability. Others were from Donovan, mocking my early business ventures in email chains with his college friends. One was from Harold to his law partners, coldly stating, "We no longer have a relationship with him. It's a closed chapter." "If we're going to talk about a partnership," I said, my voice calm and low, "we need to start with the truth." The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. I leaned forward, my eyes fixed on Harold. "RG 317. He flinched, it was barely perceptible, a slight tightening around his eyes, but it was enough. "What's that?" Isabel asked, her voice a little too loud, a little too sharp. "Isn't that some stupid password you used for your video games in high school?" "No," I said, my gaze unwavering. "It's the code my grandmother etched into the ring you all dismissed as a worthless trinket." Donovan scoffed, trying to regain his footing. "You're chasing ghosts, Cal. This is meaningless." "But Ruth Green isn't meaningless, is she?" I asked, letting her name drop into the room like a stone into a still pond. The name hit them like a physical blow. Margaret let out a small, strangled gasp. Harold's face went white. Donovan froze, his bravado evaporating in an instant. "She was my mother," I stated, not as a question but as a fact. "My biological mother, and every single one of you knew it." Margaret started to cry, her sobs quiet and shaking. We did what we thought was best," she stammered. "Best for who?" I shot back, my voice rising for the first time. "Best for the family's reputation, best for Harold's career. You didn't just lie to me about my adoption. You lied about who she was. You buried her memory and tried to bury me along with it." Isabel stood up, her face flushed with anger. "You're being so dramatic. We moved on. You should have, too." "Moved on?" I turned to her, my voice dropping to an icy calm. "Is that what you were doing when you spent years creating fake online profiles to spread rumors about me? When you hacked into my old email accounts to monitor my life? I traced the IPs, Izzy. They led straight back to your home office. You watched me build this empire not to cheer me on but to wait for the perfect moment to tear it down." Her mouth opened but no sound came out. She sank back onto the sofa, defeated. I had them, every lie, every betrayal, laid bare in the stark light of my living room. I looked from one shattered face to the next. The frightened child who had craved their approval was gone. In his place was a man who had finally learned their game and was about to checkmate them. I stood and walked to the window, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the hills. "You came here for money," I said, turning back to face them. You came here to sell me a fantasy of a family you destroyed, but if you want something from me, you're going to sit there and listen to the rest of the story. And then we'll decide what, if anything, you deserve." They didn't move, they didn't speak. Their silence was my answer. The next morning, the bright Texas sun did little to dispel the gloom that had settled in the house. I had them stay the night in guest rooms that were larger and more luxurious than their entire first floor, a subtle reminder of the world they had tried to keep me from. We gathered not in the living room but in my home office, a space of glass and steel that overlooked the city. It was my domain, a room built on logic and truth, and there would be no room for lies today. I stood before a large monitor, the same one I used for board meetings. They sat opposite me at a long conference table, looking like defendants awaiting a verdict. "Let's finish this," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. I clicked a button and the screen lit up with a single black and white photograph. It was the picture I had found years ago of Margaret in college, her arm around the vibrant, dark-eyed woman I now knew was my mother, Ruth Green. "You told me she was a troubled girl who died in a tragic accident," I said, my eyes locked on Harold. "That was a lie." I brought up a new set of documents on the screen, archived academic papers, research grants, and patents, all under her name. Ruth Green wasn't troubled, she was a genius, a pioneer in behavioral cryptography. The core concepts, the very architectural foundation of my company, Nexus Guard, it was all based on her theoretical work, papers she published before she was 25. They stared at the screen, speechless. "Beatrice knew," I continued. "She knew you were burying not just a person, but a legacy. That's why she left me the clue. RG-317 wasn't just a code. It was the catalog number for her research at the Seattle Public Archives. Beatrice didn't leave me $5,000. She left me an inheritance of knowledge. She led me to Alina Vargas, my mother's old research partner, who helped me understand the blueprints Ruth had left behind." I turned my attention to Donovan. "And while I was building on that legacy, you were trying to tear it down." I displayed a new file, a detailed security log from Nexus Guard's early years. It showed the repeated sophisticated attacks on our servers, tracing them through a web of proxies back to a single origin point, his real estate firm. "You thought you were being clever, routing your attacks to look like corporate espionage. But you used behavioral patterns I recognized because I grew up watching you. Your impatience, your arrogance, it was all in the code. You tried to cripple my company, hoping I'd come crawling back to the family for help." Donovan's face was a mask of crimson rage and shame. "That's a lie," he sputtered, but the evidence was undeniable. Next, I looked at Isabel. The screen filled with screenshots of her online activity, the fake profiles, the carefully worded posts, the anonymous tips sent to tech bloggers questioning my mental stability. "And you were the propaganda machine," I said calmly, "making sure that if I did succeed, the world would see me as the broken, unstable son unworthy of his success. You weren't just watching me, you were trying to write my story for me." Isabel began to sob openly. I wanted my children to have a secure future," she whispered. "They will," I said, my voice softening for a fraction of a second. "But not with your money. I've established the Beatrice Grace Foundation, dedicated to funding education for underprivileged children. Your son and daughter will be named as lifetime beneficiaries of a blind trust. They will be taken care of. But you and Donovan and Harold and Margaret will never see a single penny of my fortune." I saved the final blow for last. I clicked one more time and a video feed appeared on the screen. It was from my gate's security camera the night before they arrived, the audio enhanced. Their voices were clear. "We just have to make him feel guilty enough," Harold's voice said. "He's still a sentimental fool underneath it all," Margaret added. "He just needs to think we love him," Isabel concluded. I paused the footage on their scheming faces. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by Isabel's ragged breathing. "You didn't come here to be a family," I said, my voice low and final. "You came here on a mission and you failed." I walked to the office door and held it open. "My duty to you ended the day you left me standing in the rain at my grandmother's funeral. My loyalty now is to her memory and to the memory of the mother you tried to erase. Get out of my house." Harold rose, his face pale, his composure finally shattered. He looked like a king who had just lost his kingdom. One by one, they filed out, not daring to look at me. The sound of the front door closing behind them was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. The week after they left, the house felt different. The silence was no longer heavy with loneliness. It was light, clean, and peaceful. The ghosts were gone. I had spent 15 years building a fortress to keep the pain out, but I finally realized I didn't need walls anymore. I needed to open the gates. The following Saturday, the air was filled not with tense silence, but with the smell of barbecue smoke and the sound of laughter. I had invited my real family over, not the one of blood and betrayal, but the one of loyalty and choice. Elena Vargas was the first to arrive, her warm smile a comforting presence. Jackson, the investor who had taken a chance on me all those years ago, showed up with a case of craft beer and pulled me into a hug. Layla and Marcus, my first two employees, came with their spouses and kids, filling the yard with a joyful chaos I hadn't realized I was missing. We didn't talk about Harold or Donovan or Isabel. We talked about the old days in the windowless office, about code that wouldn't compile, and about the time we nearly went bankrupt before landing our first major contract. We talked about the future, about the first scholarships being awarded by the Beatrice Grace Foundation. Children, some of them my friends and some the first recipients of the foundation's support, ran across the lawn, their laughter echoing in the warm evening air. I watched them, a pang in my chest, thinking of the 10-year-old boy who ate his birthday pizza alone. I knew I had done the right thing. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the hills, Alina sat down next to me on the terrace steps. She handed me a worn, folded piece of paper. "Beatrice wanted me to give you this when you were truly free," she said softly. I unfolded it carefully. It was a letter not from Beatrice but from my mother, Ruth. Her handwriting was elegant and precise. The letter wasn't long, but every word landed like a revelation. "My dearest son," it began, "I write this not knowing if you will ever read it. I had to make an impossible choice to protect you or to keep you. I chose to protect you even if it meant letting you go. They will never tell you this, but I didn't want to give you up. I fought for you. But they had the power and I only had my work. I entrusted my legacy to Beatrice, knowing she would one day guide it to you. Know this, you were not a mistake. You were and always will be my greatest work." Tears I hadn't shed in 20 years streamed down my face. All my life, I had felt like a problem to be solved, a burden to be carried. But to her, I was a legacy, I was loved. I looked up from the leads. And my eyes fell on a hummingbird hovering by the feeder, its tiny body a jewel of iridescent green, its wings a blur of motion. For years, I had watched them from my balcony, seeing them as symbols of my own restless solitude. But now, surrounded by people who had chosen me, I saw it differently. It wasn't restless, it was free. I slipped the jade ring off my finger and held it up to the fading light. The cool stone felt different now, not like an anchor but like a key. I didn't need it anymore. I had found my own light just as Beatrice had promised. Later that night, after everyone had gone, I stood alone on the terrace, the lights of Austin twinkling below. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was full of the echoes of laughter, the warmth of friendship, and the peace of a war finally won. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was home. The past was no longer a ghost haunting me. It was a story I had survived, a story I could now put down. And for the first time, I felt ready to start writing the next chapter.